June 22, 1941, the morning broke over the Soviet Union with an uneasy calm. But that calm was shattered as Operation Barbarossa began. Nazi Germany, in a meticulously planned and overwhelming offensive, invaded the Soviet Union with a force that seemed unstoppable. Millions of soldiers crossed the borders, armored divisions rolling across the vast plains, and the Luftwaffe dominating the skies. Stalin, despite receiving countless intelligence warnings in the weeks prior, remained skeptical, convinced that Hitler would not risk war with the Soviet Union while still entangled in the West. Yet the reality of June 22nd could not be denied. The Red Army, despite its numerical superiority, was caught unprepared. Communication breakdowns, outdated equipment, and purges of experienced officers had left the Soviet military vulnerable. Cities and towns fell with alarming speed, and the initial shock sent ripples through Moscow. Stalin's inner circle debated response, but the dictator himself remained largely silent, absorbing the news with a cold, calculating composure that concealed the storm raging beneath. As the days and weeks unfolded, the situation grew direr. The Germans pushed deep into Soviet territory, capturing key cities and strategic points with brutal efficiency. Reports of massacres, scorched earth tactics, and atrocities against civilians reached Moscow, heightening both fear and determination within the Kremlin. Stalin's policies of rigid control over intelligence created a paradox. He trusted very few but demanded absolute loyalty. When his advisors warned him of the sheer scale of the German advance, he oscillated between disbelief and grim acceptance. For months he relied on counterintelligence, his spies, and intercepted communications to map Hitler's intentions, but the fog of war made every decision a dangerous gamble. Meanwhile, the United States remained distant, officially neutral but increasingly involved in supporting the Allies through programs like Lend-Lease, which provided crucial material aid to the Soviet Union and Britain. Stalin understood the importance of American industrial power, but the thought of direct U.S. involvement in the war seemed almost hypothetical. The vast Atlantic, the Pacific engagements, and Roosevelt's cautious diplomacy all painted a picture of delayed action, one that might never materialize in time to turn the tide against the Wehrmacht. The winter of 1941 arrived with staggering consequences. The Soviet Union, battered but not broken, faced one of the coldest seasons in decades. Troops were freezing, supply lines were overstretched, and morale wavered. Yet the Soviet command began to adapt. Stalin, after initial hesitation, took decisive steps to relocate factories, mobilize reserves, and coordinate defense with his generals. The harsh Russian winter, combined with relentless resistance by Soviet forces, began to stall the German advance. It was during this time that Stalin, receiving reports from multiple intelligence channels, became aware of shifting dynamics in global alliances. Japan's movements in the Pacific, Hitler's communications, and Churchill's urgent messages highlighted a growing interconnectedness of the war. Stalin's mind, already burdened by the defense of his homeland, now had to consider the implications of potential U.S. involvement, even if indirect, and how this could reshape the strategic balance. Each intercepted message, each coded telegram, each analysis presented by his staff contributed to an evolving understanding. The war was no longer confined to the European theater, and Hitler's ambitions might reach far beyond what even the Soviets had anticipated. By late 1941, as the Red Army began to regain some footing in key areas, Stalin's attention turned increasingly to diplomatic intelligence. Reports from Moscow's embassies in Washington, London, and Tokyo painted a complex picture of alliances and intentions. The U.S., though officially neutral, was accelerating its support to Allied nations. Roosevelt's speeches, public statements, and private communications hinted at a commitment to confront Axis aggression if provoked directly. Stalin, aware of the precariousness of Soviet survival, recognized that German miscalculations could draw the U.S. into the war sooner than expected. At the same time, Hitler's focus was divided. While obsessed with the Soviet front, he underestimated American resolve and industrial capacity. For Stalin, this was a dangerous window of opportunity. He needed to fortify defenses, coordinate production, and anticipate every possible Axis maneuver, all while preparing for the uncertain event that would eventually arrive in December 1941. The Soviet Union's survival depended not only on military resilience but also on keen awareness of global political currents. and Stalin's attention to these details was absolute, leaving nothing to chance. December 7, 1941. The world shifted in a single, devastating moment. News of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor tore across the globe, instantly transforming a distant Pacific conflict into a full-scale world war. Stalin, in his Kremlin office, received reports detailing the surprise assault on the American naval base, the devastation wrought upon battleships, aircraft carriers, and the sheer loss of life. Though Stalin had anticipated American industrial might and its eventual involvement, the immediacy of the attack shocked even him. The strategic calculus of the war changed overnight. While the Soviet Union had been fighting for months against the German juggernaut in the East, the sudden involvement of the United States introduced a new variable of immense scale and capability. Stalin's advisors were quick to analyze what this meant for the Axis powers. Japan had acted without consulting Hitler, but the broader implications for Germany were inescapable. Stalin, historically cautious and calculating, understood that the balance of power was on the verge of a dramatic transformation. Almost immediately, the intelligence networks in Moscow began working overtime. Intercepts, diplomatic communications, and coded messages were scrutinized for signs of German reaction. By December 11, 1941, Hitler formally declared war on the United States, a move that stunned even seasoned Soviet strategists. This declaration was not merely symbolic. It represented a profound strategic misstep that Stalin could now exploit. Hitler's miscalculation lay in assuming that the U.S. would be slow to mobilize, and that Germany could continue its campaigns in Europe and the Soviet Union without facing a fully industrialized American war machine. Stalin, ever attentive to detail, recognized the dual opportunity. The Soviet Union could now coordinate more openly with the Allies, secure supply lines, and gain material support from the U.S., all while Hitler stretched his forces across multiple fronts. Stalin's internal memos from this period reveal a careful, pragmatic acknowledgement of this advantage. While the German threat remained lethal and immediate, the long-term calculus now favored the Allies. In Moscow, Stalin convened his closest advisors and military leaders. Discussions centered on two pressing issues: the immediate defense against the Wehrmacht's winter offensives and the strategic exploitation of Germany's expanded conflict. Intelligence indicated that German supply lines were increasingly strained. Morale among troops was faltering in the harsh Russian winter, and Hitler's attention would soon be divided by the global scale of the war. Stalin's orders were precise and uncompromising: fortify defensive positions, relocate critical industrial resources beyond the reach of German bombers, and coordinate with Allied powers for maximal material and logistical support. Every decision was informed by the recognition that American involvement, once fully mobilized, would accelerate the defeat of Nazi Germany. Stalin's understanding of global power dynamics, honed by years of political ruthlessness and wartime exigencies, now played a crucial role in shaping Soviet military strategy for the months ahead. By early 1942, the Soviet Union's response had begun to take shape. Factories were relocated east of the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German aircraft. New divisions were trained and deployed. Intelligence networks were expanded to ensure early warnings of German movements. Simultaneously, Stalin maintained careful diplomatic contact with Roosevelt and Churchill, ensuring that the flow of Lend-Lease supplies, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and raw materials remained uninterrupted. Stalin was aware that American engagement in Europe would be gradual, but Hitler's declaration had removed the pretense of neutrality. The United States was no longer a distant observer, but an active participant whose industrial might and manpower could tip the scales irrevocably. The psychological impact on Hitler, meanwhile, was significant. By declaring war on a nation capable of producing thousands of aircraft, tanks, and warships, he committed Germany to a multi-front confrontation that would ultimately stretch resources beyond sustainability. Stalin, who had weathered the initial onslaught of Barbarossa and survived the devastating losses of 1941, now perceived the faint outlines of a strategic opening. As 1942 progressed, Soviet intelligence began monitoring American troop deployments, production rates, and strategic planning. Stalin understood that Hitler's declaration had unintentionally united disparate Allied forces more cohesively. Soviet generals and planners worked tirelessly to coordinate with Western allies, anticipating joint operations and the eventual opening of a second front in Europe. Stalin's focus was singular: preserve Soviet territory, maximize the material advantage gained from American support, and exploit the overextension of German forces. The morale of the Soviet people, battered by relentless warfare, was reinforced through propaganda highlighting Hitler's misjudgment. The narrative was clear: the Axis powers, overconfident and overextended, were vulnerable. Stalin's strategic patience, disciplined planning, and meticulous use of intelligence positioned the Soviet Union to endure the ongoing conflict while simultaneously preparing for the turning point that the United States entry promised. The months that followed would test the Soviet Union in unprecedented ways. The Battle of Stalingrad, the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, and the relentless pressure of German offensives demanded constant vigilance. Stalin, despite his reputation for ruthlessness, relied on precise military analysis and coordination with his commanders to direct Soviet forces effectively. Hitler's declaration of war on the U.S., once fully understood in Moscow, was recognized as both a danger and an opportunity. The Soviet Union, battered but increasingly resilient, could now anticipate a coordinated Allied strategy in which American industrial and military capacity would be leveraged to apply simultaneous pressure on Germany from multiple theaters. Stalin's calculations were meticulous. Every deployment, every supply decision, every intelligence intercept was part of a grand strategy aimed at ensuring survival and eventual victory. By mid-1942, the global conflict had irrevocably changed. Stalin, aware of the stakes, intensified internal security measures, refined military operations, and ensured that the Soviet Union remained both a formidable defensive power and an emerging offensive force. Hitler's declaration, intended to intimidate and consolidate Axis power, had instead expanded the Allies' resolve. Stalin's awareness of this turning point marked a critical juncture in the war, highlighting the intersection of strategic foresight, intelligence, and the shifting tides of global power. The Soviet Union's survival and eventual role in the defeat of Nazi Germany was inseparably linked to the consequences of that fateful decision. When Hitler's miscalculated declaration on the United States transformed the scope and scale of World War II. By late 1944, the momentum on the Eastern Front had decisively shifted. The Red Army, strengthened by years of brutal experience, strategic planning, and immense sacrifice, now advanced steadily toward the heart of German-occupied territories. Stalin's foresight in responding to Hitler's declaration of war on the United States had created a multidimensional advantage. While German forces struggled against the combined pressures of Soviet offensives, the growing involvement of the Western Allies, and the industrial output of the United States, the Soviet Union gained both breathing space and leverage. Stalin's approach was methodical. No movement was uncalculated. Every offensive was paired with logistical foresight, reinforcement planning, and coordination of intelligence. The misjudgment by Hitler to open a second major conflict with the United States had overextended Germany in ways Stalin had long anticipated but could not have exploited without years of careful preparation, consolidation, and ruthless prioritization of resources. During this period, Stalin's attentiveness to the global balance of power became increasingly evident. While the Red Army pushed westward, Stalin maintained keen awareness of American and British campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and eventually France. He monitored troop movements, production output, and Allied strategic planning with painstaking attention to detail, recognizing that the success of the Soviet advance depended not only on what the Red Army did on the Eastern Front, but also on the pressure the Allies could apply on Germany from multiple theaters. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States, initially an audacious political move, had forced Germany to split its attention and resources, leaving it vulnerable to precisely the kind of coordinated, multilateral pressure that Stalin had long understood could turn the tide. By exploiting these vulnerabilities, Stalin ensured that the Soviet Union's military strategy remained proactive, adaptive, and aligned with the broader trajectory of global conflict. The winter and spring campaigns of 1944 and early 1945 further demonstrated the consequences of Hitler's miscalculation. Soviet forces systematically liberated occupied regions, inflicting heavy losses on German units and steadily weakening their operational capabilities. Stalin, in correspondence and meetings with his generals, emphasized the necessity of sustained pressure and total mobilization. Every logistical challenge, every intelligence report, Every diplomatic interaction with Allied representatives was integrated into a grand strategy designed to capitalize on Germany's overextension and the inevitability of American and British engagement. Stalin's understanding of the war's global dynamics allowed him to exploit the unintended consequences of Hitler's declaration, transforming what could have been an existential threat into a strategic opportunity for Soviet ascendancy. The Red Army's advances were not merely territorial. They were a demonstration of the effectiveness of Stalin's integration of intelligence, military strategy, and geopolitical insight, all informed by the domino effect of Hitler's misstep. By mid-1945, the consequences of Hitler's declaration were fully realized. The United States, mobilized and determined, had supplied vast quantities of war material to the Allies, while its own forces engaged Axis powers across multiple fronts. The Soviet Union, strengthened by years of relentless defense and strategic counteroffensives, coordinated indirectly with the Western Allies to maximize pressure on Germany. Hitler's overextension, once subtle, became catastrophic as Germany's military machine collapsed under simultaneous assaults from east and west. Stalin's calculated patience, disciplined management of resources, and meticulous exploitation of intelligence allowed the Soviet Union not only to survive but to emerge as a decisive force in the Allied victory. Every strategic decision, every adaptation to battlefield realities, and every anticipation of Hitler's misjudgments contributed to the ultimate collapse of Nazi Germany. In these final stages, Stalin's awareness of global power dynamics reached its apex. The declaration of war on the United States, initially perceived as a provocative show of dominance by Hitler, had inadvertently provided the Soviet Union with critical strategic advantages that were leveraged to full effect. Stalin's combination of ruthless pragmatism, careful intelligence analysis, and operational oversight ensured that the Red Army's advances were both decisive and sustainable. By coordinating efforts across military, logistical, and political spheres, Stalin ensured that Germany could not recover from the compounded pressures of the Eastern Front, the American industrial and military surge, and the increasingly coordinated Allied strategies. The trajectory of World War II, in large part shaped by Hitler's own miscalculations, had now tilted irreversibly by months of observation, careful analysis of Hitler's strategic miscalculations, and continuous monitoring of Allied movements in the West. The result was a multi-front pressure that Germany could no longer withstand. Each Soviet victory, each liberated territory, and each successful encirclement of German divisions reflected not just military might, but the careful orchestration of a global strategy that took full advantage of Hitler's fatal error in declaring war on a powerful and mobilized United States, and the Soviet Union stood at the center of this historic transformation. By the summer of 1945, the full implications of Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States had crystallized in Stalin's strategic calculations. The Soviet Union, battered but resilient, had leveraged every resource, every intelligence report, and every ounce of military capability to turn the Axis misstep into a decisive advantage. Stalin's meticulous approach to wartime leadership, ensuring that production, logistics, and troop deployment were in perfect alignment, was now paying off on a scale that few outside the Kremlin could fully comprehend. Hitler's gamble had forced Germany to fight a war on multiple fronts simultaneously, and the United States' industrial and military mobilization compounded the pressure. Stalin, who had survived the initial shock of Operation Barbarossa and the catastrophic losses of 1941, now stood at a moment where the tide of the war had irrevocably shifted in favor of the Allies. The overextension of German forces, coupled with the relentless advance of the Red Army, demonstrated the far-reaching consequences of Hitler's strategic hubris. Across the battlefields of Eastern Europe, Stalin's vision was coming to fruition. Soviet forces systematically advancing liberated city after city from German occupation. The meticulous planning that characterized every Soviet campaign, from logistics to intelligence coordination, enabled the Red Army to exploit German weaknesses with unprecedented precision. Stalin's decisions were informed, but also prepared for the administrative and political challenges of liberating occupied territories. The consequences of Hitler's declaration, initially intended to intimidate, had inadvertently strengthened Soviet strategic positioning. Stalin's meticulous oversight coupled with an acute awareness of global power shifts, allowed the USSR to emerge not just as a survivor of the conflict, but as a central architect of the Axis collapse. The simultaneous pressures applied by the Soviet Union and the United States created a perfect storm that Germany could neither counter nor endure. By the closing months of 1945, Stalin's strategic foresight, patience, and ruthless efficiency had reshaped the European theater. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States, a bold, overreaching gamble, had catalyzed a sequence of events that played directly into Stalin's carefully constructed wartime calculations. The Soviet Union had withstood the unimaginable devastation of the early war years, exploited German miscalculations, and positioned itself to emerge as a decisive victor in the final campaigns. Stalin's command, informed by relentless analysis, intelligence gathering, and meticulous planning, ensured that the Soviet Union not only survived but gained leverage in the post-war world order. Every city liberated, every German division defeated, and every logistical advantage secured was a testament to Stalin's ability to translate Hitler's missteps into concrete strategic gains. The full consequences of Hitler's declaration were now plain. The Axis powers were in retreat. The Allies were united and mobilized, and the Soviet Union had emerged as a central pillar of the impending post-war order. By the closing weeks of 1945, the Red Army's relentless push into the heart of Germany demonstrated the full consequences of Hitler's miscalculation. Stalin, having meticulously orchestrated decades of political control and wartime planning, now watched the culmination of strategic patience and foresight unfold on the battlefield. Every offensive, every liberation of a city, and every logistical triumph reflected not just brute force but the careful exploitation of Germany's overextension. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States, a move intended to intimidate and consolidate Axis dominance, had instead amplified Germany's vulnerabilities on every front. The sheer scale of the Allied response, fueled by American industrial might and coordinated pressure from both East and West, created a scenario Stalin had long calculated but could only now witness in full. In Moscow, directives flowed relentlessly, ensuring that Soviet advances were not halted by fatigue, supply issues, or German desperation tactics. Stalin's combination of ruthless efficiency and strategic foresight was unmatched, and history would later mark this period as the turning point where Axis ambitions began to crumble irreversibly. Even as Soviet forces advanced relentlessly, Stalin remained vigilant, understanding that military victories alone would not secure ultimate success. The intelligence networks he had nurtured since the beginning of Barbarossa provided continuous insight into German troop morale, logistical strains, and command failures. Stalin's capacity to interpret these signals, combined with the strategic advantage created by Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States, allowed the Soviet Union to plan with unprecedented confidence. Every movement on the battlefield was calculated not just for immediate tactical gains, but for long-term geopolitical positioning. Stalin's actions during these months demonstrated the integration of military strategy, intelligence analysis, and global political awareness, a combination that transformed Hitler's bold gamble into a profound disadvantage for the Axis powers. As the final months approached, the Red Army's relentless pressure created a domino effect. Across the German military, units were forced into retreat, supply lines collapsed, and morale deteriorated under the dual weight of Soviet advances and American engagement across multiple theaters. Stalin, acutely aware of the larger implications, ensured that every success on the battlefield was leveraged strategically. The Soviet Union's gains were not merely territorial. They were a demonstration of the effective exploitation of Hitler's overreach. Stalin's decisions, driven by careful analysis, foresight, and the opportunity presented by Germany's declaration of war on the United States, positioned the Soviet Union as both a military victor and a dominant force in shaping the post-war order. By carefully balancing aggressive offensives with prudent consolidation, Stalin ensured that the Red Army's victories would be both decisive and sustainable. The final stages of the European campaign illustrated the full extent of Stalin's strategic acumen. Soviet forces, strengthened and methodically coordinated, applied relentless pressure on German defenses while simultaneously preparing for the political and logistical challenges of post-war reconstruction. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States intended as a demonstration of power, had created cascading consequences that left Germany vulnerable to simultaneous pressures from multiple fronts. Stalin's careful orchestration of military, intelligence, and diplomatic resources ensured that the Soviet Union could capitalize on these weaknesses fully. Each liberated city, each captured division, and each logistical success reflected a broader strategy, shaped by the unintended consequences of Hitler's overreach. By integrating battlefield victories with global awareness and precise planning, Stalin transformed the Axis's bold miscalculation into a cornerstone of Soviet wartime triumph. By the time the final German strongholds fell, the strategic reality that Hitler had created by declaring war on the United States was unmistakable. Germany, overextended and exhausted, could not withstand the compounded pressures of a unified and mobilized Allied front. Stalin's leadership throughout this period, ruthless, meticulous, and informed by relentless intelligence gathering, had ensured that the Soviet Union not only survived the greatest existential threat of its history, but emerged as a central power in the final defeat of Nazi Germany. Every operational decision, every exploitation of German weakness, and every anticipation of Allied cooperation was made possible by the chain reaction initiated by Hitler's declaration. The war, which had once seemed like a desperate fight for survival, now reflected the profound consequences of calculated strategy, opportunistic adaptation, and the historic miscalculations of the Axis powers. As the final winter of the war approached, the Soviet Union had transformed from a nation fighting for survival into a decisive force, shaping the fate of Europe. The Red Army's relentless campaigns across Eastern Europe reflected not only brute strength but also the meticulous planning and strategic foresight that Stalin had enforced since the earliest days of Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States, which initially seemed audacious and potentially advantageous, had now backfired spectacularly. German forces, stretched across multiple theaters and confronting an industrially superior adversary, found themselves unable to regroup or mount a meaningful counteroffensive. Stalin, ever attentive to the global chessboard, recognized that this overextension was more than a military vulnerability. It was a historic opportunity. The combination of American production, Allied coordination, and Soviet operational efficiency created a scenario in which the Axis powers were effectively trapped by their own miscalculations. By early 1945, the Red Army had crossed into the heart of Germany, applying constant pressure on weakened German positions while maintaining cohesion across vast stretches of territory. Stalin's strategic oversight was apparent in every detail. The careful allocation of reinforcements, the timing of offensives, and the coordination with Allied advances from the West all reflected a holistic understanding of the war's shifting dynamics. Intelligence reports continuously highlighted the consequences of Hitler's declaration of war on the United States, the diversion of German resources, the strain on supply lines, and the erosion of troop morale. Stalin's response was measured but relentless. No victory was left to chance, no gap in planning overlooked. The cumulative effect of Germany's overreach, compounded by Stalin's disciplined strategy, created a trajectory in which Soviet advances were not just victories in isolation. They were decisive steps toward the final defeat of the Axis. Throughout this period, Stalin also monitored the broader global implications. The United States, fully mobilized and producing at an unprecedented scale, had begun to project power across both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters, forcing Germany and its allies to respond on multiple fronts simultaneously. Stalin understood that the consequences of Hitler's miscalculation extended far beyond Europe. The integration of American industrial capacity into Allied operations fundamentally altered the strategic landscape. Soviet planners leveraged this indirectly, timing offensives to coincide with Western advances and exploiting German overcommitments. Stalin's calculations ensured that the Soviet Union could maintain relentless pressure on the Eastern Front without jeopardizing long-term operational effectiveness. Every Soviet victory was amplified by the global context, transforming battlefield gains into strategic momentum. By April 1945, the Red Army stood at the gates of Berlin. The streets were a maze of destruction, rubble, and desperate German defenders. Yet the momentum of history was unmistakably on the Soviet side. Stalin, having endured 4 years of unimaginable losses, Relentless planning and constant vigilance now witnessed the full consequences of Hitler's audacious misstep, the declaration of war on the United States. That single decision, intended to intimidate and expand Axis influence, had created a chain reaction that ultimately strengthened the Soviet position. American industrial power, now fully mobilized, coupled with the relentless pressure of the Western Allies, had forced Germany into a position it could never recover from. Stalin's meticulous orchestration of Soviet military operations, his relentless intelligence gathering, and his ability to exploit the overextension of Axis forces had turned the tide irreversibly. The war that had once seemed like a desperate struggle for survival had transformed into a clear path toward victory. Inside the Kremlin, Stalin remained composed. Yet his strategic mind was fully aware of the magnitude of the moment. Every Soviet victory, every liberated city, every German division encircled and destroyed was a testament not only to the resilience of the Soviet people, but also to the consequences of Hitler's fatal error. Stalin's command had ensured that the Red Army would not simply survive the war, it would emerge as a decisive power shaping the post-war order. Intelligence reports detailed the crumbling German resistance, the overextension of supply lines, and the exhaustion of Axis forces, all of which reinforced the Soviet advantage created inadvertently by Hitler's declaration of war on the United States. The alignment of strategy, opportunity, and the industrial and military might of the Allies had produced a scenario in which the Axis powers were doomed, and the Soviet Union positioned at the center of the world stage. By May 1945, Berlin fell, and Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally. The monumental consequences of Hitler's declaration were fully realized. A war that could have dragged on for years with catastrophic uncertainty had been hastened toward collapse by his miscalculated expansion. Stalin's leadership throughout the conflict, his ability to anticipate and exploit enemy missteps, and his unyielding attention to global strategic shifts had ensured that the Soviet Union emerged not only victorious but indispensable in shaping the post-war world. The combined pressures of the Soviet advance from the East and the American and British push from the West made clear that Hitler's decision had accelerated the Axis defeat rather than delayed it. In that moment, the vast scope of strategic foresight became apparent. The war had become not just a struggle for territory, but a contest of global power, one in which Stalin's ruthless pragmatism had turned catastrophe into opportunity. The lessons of this historical turning point remain profound. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States, a seemingly audacious act of aggression, demonstrates the dangers of miscalculating the resolve and capability of global powers. For Stalin, it highlighted the value of patience, strategic foresight, and relentless intelligence analysis. The Soviet Union's ability to endure staggering losses, adapt to the evolving battlefield, and exploit opportunities created by enemy errors ensured not only its survival but its central role in shaping the outcome of World War II. History would remember the sequence as a moment when calculated ruthlessness, strategic vision, and global awareness intersected to change the course of human events. And so, when Stalin learned that Hitler had declared war on the United States, he recognized more than a bold political act. He saw a monumental opportunity, an opportunity born of miscalculation, of overreach, and of hubris. Through patience, planning, and an unwavering commitment to survival and victory, Stalin transformed what could have been catastrophic into a decisive turning point, ensuring that the Soviet Union would stand at the forefront of history as the Allies closed in on a devastated, defeated Germany. The world had shifted irrevocably, and the consequences of a single decision by Hitler reverberated through the final chapters of the greatest conflict humanity had ever faced. Thanks for watching.